All right, you lovely people. I know I left you on a bit of a cliffhanger there. You're like, how do you do it? Let's find out. So now recall I said at the beginning of this module that Norman Kretzmann wants to justify and defend religious morality. Now recall, religious morality is the idea that moral goodness is what God approves of or is what, God commands. And we've seen that Euthyphro's dilemma creates a problem for this. If we accept path one, we get divine command theory and all the problems of divine command theory. Or we could accept path two and embrace some form of theological rationalism. Now recall, theological rationalism is what says that God's commands are not arbitrary, but have reasons and justifications for them. So that was, again, theological rationalism. Now, Kretzmann does mention the Euthyphro, so he does know that, look, these two paths, he knows these paths very well. He's read the Euthyphro, he's studied them, and he talks about them. And indeed, if you look at the top of page 35, you'll see that Kretzmann, there they are. They're the two paths. He kind of relabels them and switches the order for some reason. But yes, there are the two paths of Euthyphro's dilemma. Now, I won't focus, because he's so convoluted in his writing. I know it's exhausting. That's why I'm here for. They pay me the big bucks to make it easier. So I won't focus too closely on what he's saying on page 35. You can look at it again if you want. You have a copy. I just don't like his clumsy language. So let's go back to how I've been putting the two paths of Euthyphro's dilemma. There they are. And now if you compare what Kretzmann says on page 35 to what I'm saying here of how I've been talking about these two paths, you can see that, first of all, path one is what Kretzmann calls TS, or theological subjectivism. That's just path number one. He just gives it a new name. That's fine. We'll call path one theological subjectivism. Fair enough, TS. And then you'll see that he takes path two, what I've been calling path two, he calls TO, or theological objectivism. Now, I guess he didn't like my names. Anyway, so he gives them new names. But we've already seen, look, Kretzmann rejects divine command theory. I've told you that for all the reasons that we have seen. And look, Kretzmann doesn't call it divine command theory. He calls it theological subjectivism, TS. And again, his rejection of TS, of theological subjectivism, of divine command theory, these are all the same bloody thing. Ugh, that's such a mouthful. This is all, he rejects it all for all the reasons that we've seen. So really nothing new there. You can reread it and see he just, has the same ideas that we talked about in the last module. And then similarly, Kretzmann also talks about theological rationalism. But he calls that instead theological objectivism, or TO, and Kretzmann rejects TO. He rejects theological objectivism. He rejects theological objectivism and rationalism. Oh God, they're all the same thing. And he rejects them all for all the reasons we saw previously about why theological rationalism is wrong. But he does give it a new spin, so maybe it's worth rehearsing it, because he does say, look, God's a perfect being. One of the perfections of God is absolute independence. So God as a perfect being is absolutely independent. And what Kretzmann means by that is that God does not depend on anything. A perfect being would not depend on anything. The perfect being is self-sufficient, boom, because it has everything it needs, because it is everything, right? It's perfection. And this is his version of the refutation, again, of theological rationalism or theological objectivism, or TO, whatever you want to call it. It goes by many names. And it would recall that, theological rationalism, does say that God depends on her knowledge of good and evil, and then issues the commands accordingly. We saw this last time. Remember, this was just a challenge. How I put it in the last module was that theological rationalism just makes morality independent of God. And if it's independent of God, God no longer looks omnipotent. That's how we called it in the previous module. Okay, this is all horribly confusing, I know. So let me just summarize. It's because everyone's using different words and it's so annoying. And I know you got to learn all these stupid phrases that mean the exact same thing. It drives us crazy. So just repeat. In the last module, I introduced you, along with Mr. Green, to divine command theory. And I and Mr. Green showed you some problems with divine command theory. Now, Kretzmann gives divine command theory a new name. He calls it theological subjectivism. But again, he just means divine command theory. Theological subjectivism equals divine command theory. And Kretzmann agrees with everything that we've seen that divine command theory is wrong. So he rejects divine command theory. He rejects theological subjectivism. He rejects TS. They're all the same. Similarly, in the last module, I introduced you to theological rationalism, and I showed you some problems with it. Mr. Green did as well. And Kretzmann calls theological rationalism theological objectivism, but yes, he just means, yes, TO is the same thing as the rationalism we've been talking about. And Kretzmann once again agrees that theological rationalism, or TO, or whatever you want to call it, has the same problems. And so he rejects that too. He just added that new thing about being independent. That's fine. Same idea about God is not omnipotent, God is not perfect if there is something outside of God. Now I know what you guys are saying. Professor, this was clickbait. We clicked here because we wanted to know, how does he do it? How does he resolve it? Instead, you're just rehashing Euthyphro's dilemma. And I'm like, I know. I got to do this because Kretzmann changes everything around and I got to change it back and so we can get through it. But yes, okay. I think we've repeated endlessly that I was very clear. Kretzmann knows Euthyphro's dilemma and he agrees Euthyphro's dilemma is a huge problem to religious morality. Okay, I just want to make this clear. And so he agrees with Plato, he agrees with me, he agrees with Mr. Green that these two paths stink. Theological subjectivism, theological objectivism, path 1, path 2, whatever you want to call them, they're bad options. So how does he do it? How is Kretzmann going to resolve this dilemma? And like I said at the end of the last video, Kretzmann is going to focus on God's perfection and in particular, God's perfect goodness. That is going to be the secret. And how Kretzmann starts this discussion is he focuses on has us think about the concept or the nature of God. Again, we don't have to assume God exists, just what do we mean by when we talk about God? And Kretzmann starts with the usual conception of God as a perfect being, meaning God is omnipotent, so that's all powerful. God is omniscient, so that's all knowing. God is omnibenevolent. God is all good. We've seen these before. He thinks, yeah, if you're just thinking about the God as the perfect being, these are natural attributes you're going to come to. But we also saw that he thought that God is absolutely independent. I just mentioned that not too long ago. That is, God cannot depend on anything external or separate from herself, because to depend on something external would make God imperfect, because God would be lacking something. And so God, as this omnipotent, absolutely independent being, must be absolute sovereign of all, lack for nothing, depend on nothing. God is independent. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. Now, okay, there's some attributes. Cool. And now Kretzmann is going to focus on another attribute we have not mentioned yet. And this is going to be the kicker, shall we say, because this is an attribute that's kind of subtle, but one that's going to give Kretzmann everything he wants. It's like Christmas morning and Kretzmann's opening the box and it's no more Euthyphro's dilemma. Let's see what's in this box here. So again, as part, I'm silly, I know. As part of perfection, God, Kretzmann says, is absolutely simple. That is, God is not composed of any parts. God doesn't have an arm, a hand, a brain, a stomach, and anything else you can think of, any parts. God is not composed of parts because God is absolutely simple. Similarly, God cannot be distinguished from any of her attributes, because if God was composed of parts, or if God could be distinguished from her attributes, that would mean that God depends on those parts or on those attributes. But as we've already seen, God depends on nothing. She is absolutely independent. And I think we can use an example because basically, as Kretzmann notes, pretty much anything you can think of is not simple in this way, because pretty much everything is composed of something. So I'll just take a very simple example, water. You know, the stuff you drink. Oh, that's good. I'm going to be spitting now. But look, water is water precisely because of its components. Because I don't know if you remember from chemistry, what's in this glass? Well, water, of course. And is it half full or empty? Who knows? Depends if you're a pessimist or an optimist. What was I talking about? Water. What is it composed of? If you recall in chemistry, this is each of these water, is it a molecule? Man, it's been a while. Water molecule is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, H2O. You guys remember this, I hope. So if you change any of that, if you change one of the hydrogen atoms or change the oxygen to something else, you do not have water and probably shouldn't be drinking it. You're going to get something else. So again, water is composed of 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. That's what makes water water. Change any of that, you do not have water anymore. You have something else. So water depends on the 2 hydrogen and the 1 oxygen to be water. And notice, this is kind of interesting. Those 2 hydrogen atoms and that oxygen atom don't need water for anything. They're hydrogen and they're oxygen, not because they're in water. They're just, because that's what they are. They're these atoms that just happen to come together to make water. So the hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atom are independent of water because they're not water. They come together to make it, but they're not water itself. They're just hydrogen and oxygen. But of course, if you studied chemistry, you'll know for sure that, well, yeah, but you can break hydrogen and oxygen down. So they depend on particular arrangements of, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And that's about all I remember from those classes. So I won't go any further. But I suppose if you took like a quantum mechanics course or something, then you know that, of course, protons and neutrons and that stuff might be based on subatomic particles. And then just the merry dance just keeps going, I guess, forever, or at least further than I can know. But Kretsman is saying that God is not like water, like those atoms or quarks or whatever else, neutrinos. I don't know. I'm just making up words now, I think. Because God does not depend on anything to be God. God is just God, the perfect being. And so God has no parts, no hands, no feet, no bones. No whatever. But also, God cannot be thought as separate from her properties. For the same reason, if you can separate God from her properties, then God is independent of her properties, and now God's dependent on having this property. And we're like, oh my gosh, this is a nightmare. Oh, but the good news is we can make sense of this. It's quite wild. Because what Kretsman wants to say is that, we say things like God is perfectly powerful, or God is perfectly good, or God is perfectly knowing, whatever it is, right? God is perfectly loving, whatever it is we think God's perfections involve. But again, simplicity means we cannot distinguish God from her perfections. So this is where things get a little wild now. What the heck is going to happen here? Because what Kretsman says is God is her perfections. Now, what does that mean? What now? Because this is where Kretsman talks about the idea of bold simplicity. God is literally identical with perfect goodness, with perfect power, with perfect love, and so on for all of God's other perfections and attributes. In other words, God is literally perfect goodness. God is literally perfect power. God is literally perfect love. And hey, if you've ever been to a Christian wedding, if you take Professor, I've been to a Christian wedding, then I will bet you $1 million right now that you have heard this following line, which illustrates this exact idea of bold simplicity. Because every wedding I've ever been to that's been a Christian wedding has without a doubt had the exact same reading from 1 John chapter 4, verse 16. And indeed, at my wedding to my wife, our pastor did read this as well. And this is how the passage goes. God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. And I am trying not to cry because I really miss my wife right now. Literally, every day that passes is literally the longest I've ever been away from my wife. It's been months now. We've never been apart this long in our life. I'm going to stop. It's 19 years I've known her, and this is the longest I've been apart from her. It's really not easy. Anyway, she's really cool. I hope you can meet her someday. She likes to bake for my students, but I guess I don't know how you eat remote food. Anyway. Oh, wow. Okay. The pandemic's really fun for all of us. I know. Anyway, the idea that I'm getting at here, again, God is love. And whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. And the idea, what Kretzmann is getting at here, is once you truly understand the concept of God, you will understand that God, the concept of God, is about the concept of a perfect being. And then when you understand what it means, the concept of a perfect being, you'll realize that you are talking about then this absolute simplicity and then the unification of all the absolute perfections in one, becoming one literal thing, truly simple. And so again, he says, once you understand the concept of God as a perfect being, you'll realize that when you talk about God, you are also talking about perfect goodness. And when you talk about God, you're already talking about perfect power. And when you talk about God, you're also already talking about perfect love, and so on with all the rest. Because again, God is identical with and cannot be separated from her attributes. And Kretzmann believes this revelation, this realization, however you want to think of it, this he thinks solves everything. That is, once God is understood as identical with perfect goodness, so we'll just focus on perfect goodness because that's obviously about morality. Perfect love, very important, but probably a different conversation, but perfect goodness. So again, once you understand God as the perfect being, you understand that the perfect being, God, is identical, can't be separated from perfect goodness, for again, the reasons we've just said. And he says, this is it. This is the key. He says, guess what? I've just resolved Euthyphro's dilemma. Na, 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 na.
Hail the conquering hero.
Oops. My secrets. Yes, I have a microphone. And so anyway, Euthyphro's dilemma is resolved, or it's resolved or it's dissolved. Lots of fun words we could use. Here's what he thinks it is. So let's go back to Kretzmann's version of Euthyphro's dilemma, where the first path I've labeled as TS, again, for theological subjectivism. Recall, that's just divine command theory. And I have labeled the second path as TO for theological objectivism. Recall, that's just theological rationalism. We've talked about these a lot, so no panicking. It's just new names, but same idea. Now, bold simplicity means that God is literally identical with perfect goodness. So let's go to TS, theological subjectivism. He says, Kretzmann says we can just replace God with perfect goodness, because again, God is identical with perfect goodness. So we can replace God with perfect goodness, and now we get what Kretzmann calls PBS. I don't think he means the public broadcasting station, though I always think of Big Bird when I think of this. No, I don't know what he means, actually. I don't think he says perfect being subjective. I'm not sure. I don't think he says what PBS is besides the public broadcasting station. Anyhow, PBS now says that an action is right because perfect goodness commands it. And from a moral perspective, hey, that makes sense. Not much to criticize there because, perfect goodness, an action is right because perfect goodness would command that, would want that to happen. That's nothing controversial about that. No problems there. And now we can look at TO, again, theological objectivism. And we can, again, replace God with perfect goodness because, again, God is literally the same as perfect goodness. So we just swap it out. And we get what Kretzmann calls PBO. Sounds like a peanut butter jelly or something, peanut butter or something. But no, I think he means perfect being objective something. I'm not sure what. Again, I don't think he says what it means. It's really annoying. But PBO says that an action is commanded by perfect goodness because it is right. And again, from a moral perspective, this seems pretty obvious, when, being commanded by perfect goodness, of course, it's going to command the right things. And now we can just put these two together, these two paths, because each path now doesn't seem to be a big problem, so we can have both, Kretzmann says. We get both, and we just say an action is right if and only if they are the commands of perfect goodness. And once again, not very controversial about that. But again, the secret sauce is that, notice, perfect goodness is God, right? Oh, so he's got his religious morality. Because again, morality does depend on God, but it's God understood as perfect goodness. And it makes perfect sense to say that morality depends on perfect goodness. Boom. Kretzmann says, game over, man. Euthyphro, out. Drop the mic. I won't because this is a very expensive microphone. But yeah, Kretzmann thinks he's done it. Again, we have got religious morality because morality is supposed to depend on God. And why does morality depend on God, according to Kretzmann? Because morality depends on perfect goodness, and that's just another way of talking about God. Boom, done, blammo. And woo! We've done a lot in this video. Oh my gosh, can you believe it? We've done it. So I want to have one more video and just kind of illustrate maybe some potential problems now you might have with Kretzmann, because I think no one ever gets anything for free, and I think this view does have some problems, but I'll let you take a quick break, get a glass of water, drink your 2 hydrogen, your 1 oxygen. H2O. How about H2 Whoa?
Day to discover what water is really made of. H2O.
I'll see you back here in a moment.